Okay, let's start. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening if you're on the east side of this globe. My name is Paula Rabacov. I'm a policy manager at Access Partnership, AP, and I have the pleasure to be the moderator for today's webinar. I would like to start by thanking our speakers for inviting our invitation for their time and for sharing everything, well, their perspective and their knowledge on this topic, which is always timely and ever more important. And also for everyone who has joined and is here today and being part of this debate. We only have 1 hour and a lot of ground to cover, and four speakers coming from different perspectives and backgrounds, so I'll be as brief as possible. The idea is to have this conversation, as the other ones we had before, as dynamic and open as possible. So we first have a panel discussion and then a Q&A session. So for those there that are listening to us, feel free to write down in the chat all the questions that come to your mind and as they arise, because the idea is to pick those up during the Q&A. So don't shy away. This is supposed to be a safe space and really more a debate than anything else. In today's panel, the aim is to address the different aspects related to the well-being of children in immersive online environments and the different role that parents, carers, content creators, and policymakers have in promoting a safe and nurturing digital space for children. With that, I'll give the floor to the speakers, and I'd like you to introduce yourselves and also feel free to share some initial remarks. Laura, would you like to go first?
Thanks, Paula. So yes, I am Laura Higgins. I'm the Senior Director of Community Safety and Civility at Roblox. I've been at Roblox for nearly 5 years now, I can't believe it, focusing on media and digital literacy education for all of our community. Prior to that, I was the operations manager at the UK Safer Internet Centre. So I've gone from the NGO sort of victim support side and then moved over to bringing that learning into the tech world. So hopefully we're going to have a really enjoyable conversation today, and hopefully I can add some impact on both sides of the table, as it were, in the conversation. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Laura. Flynn, the floor is yours. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you for not making me go last. This would have been a very difficult set of introductions to follow. Definitely honored to be sitting with all of you today. My name is Flynn Adams. I am by trade, by profession, a forensic technologist and an enforcement and attribution specialist. I'm also the co-founder and CEO of a company called INTELiQORE Technologies. We are a technology and advisory firm that has spent the better part of the last 8 years almost exclusively in child safety and policy reform. Our focus is really primarily on building tools and protocols that provide both investigative and evidence packaging support for digitally perpetrated incidents. We work with government agencies, with law enforcement, private companies, and schools, but our goal is really to help sort of standardize the reporting process to help prioritize the acceleration of resolution. And if I could take one more second, I know, Paula, you had asked me to mention this, but you know, my background is really, even though I am in technology, was truly influenced by being a parent. In my former life, I was an executive at a large technology firm where simply being a woman in cybersecurity made me the target of a truly horrific trolling campaign. One where two individuals in particular created fake websites where they sent actual, I hate telling the story, criminals to my home to not only threaten my life, but they threatened the life of my then 3-year-old son. And my shift into creating INTELiQORE was really about sitting in front of a judge who told me that if I didn't like what people said about me on the internet, I shouldn't have a computer. And this work has really been motivated by, you know, this realization that the law and technology haven't caught up with each other yet. And as not only a parent, but as someone in my line of work, what obligations do I have to help ensure, especially for other children, that there are processes in place that allow them to control the outcome of their own digital experiences, especially when those experiences are dangerous. So.
Oh, Flynn, thank you. That's a powerful story. It's a pleasure to have you here. Adam, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. I'm Adam Ingle. I'm the global lead for digital policy at the LEGO Group. Hopefully you all know the LEGO Group and you've got fond memories from your childhood or even today playing with LEGO. But a bit about my background, and then I'll just kind of talk about LEGO's priorities in the digital environment and kind of digital play for kids. So I come from Australia. Out of law school, I worked for the Australian government in what I like to call the dark side of kind of digital policy. It was all about online surveillance and those type of things. Then I saw the light and I started working for the UK regulator, the privacy regulator, looking at how to build kind of safe and privacy respecting emerging technologies. And then wanted to get some corporate experience, but was looking for a firm that really kind of upheld a lot of the values that I took in government about age-appropriate design, about responsible play, about online safety, and the LEGO Group was fortunate enough I was fortunate enough to land a job here, and it really is a company that just embodies the values about safety by design, privacy by design. Really thinking about how we create really safe spaces for kids, because no matter where they are, LEGO wants to be there for kids, and that is increasingly online. I mean, our motto is that children are our role models, and we really do believe that. So when we think about designing our social media features, when we think about designing our games, we do think about what is the risk for children here, what is the opportunities, how do we create really child-centric positive experiences for children, and that leads over to work we're doing on kind of more interactive platforms as well. So I hope we really do live and breathe our principles here, and child safety is really kind of at the heart of our concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Paula, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Paula. So thank you. I'm very honored to be participating in this amazing panel. My name is Paula Pando de Gil. I'm the Partnership and Communications Manager at XRSI's Child Safety Initiative. And we're a collective of leaders and subject matter experts across industries and continents, working to build a collaborative safety framework that helps safeguard young individuals in the context of emerging technologies. And our work starts from meaningful benchmarks, such as the E-Safety Commissioner of Australia's Safety by Design and the UK's Age-Appropriate Design Code. A little bit of personal background as well. I'm also the mother of two amazing children, a neurodiverse 7-year-old with an incredibly rare genetic mutation called DDX3X syndrome that has multiple neurological implications, such as childhood apraxia of speech and dyspraxia, and a neurotypical 3-year-old who was barely 6 months old when the pandemic hit. So I also have a vested interest in creating safe and inclusive environments and experiences online for children, because I regularly experience firsthand both the incredible benefits that they can have, but also the very complex challenges that emerging technologies can have on a child's neurological, cognitive, and emotional development. So I'm very excited to just start this conversation with this incredible panel. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Paula. It is indeed an incredible panel. So thank you for all of you. Really, it's truly an honor. And to kick us off, I thought about just sharing quickly a personal anecdote that, in my opinion, illustrates a bit the reflection that I wanted to provoke in this first part of the panel, which is like setting the scene, let's say. So I have this young cousin, he's 11, and he does spend a lot of time using his screens, as I guess we all do, at least I do. But he does use them as a way to express himself and to be creative. It's quite cool to see, actually. But anyway, I was back home in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking, and at some point he told me that he didn't enjoy traveling so much. And I found funny because, of course, I think this is not something we hear all the time, but I asked, like, why don't you like traveling? And he responded, well, I can visit places and learn stuff from those places, about these places from the comfort of my home, so I prefer doing that. And I mean, he has a point. I just found funny because this is already something very different from what from someone from my generation would say. But the kid is super creative. He's interested. He's plugged in, and so it's not due to a lack of interest from his side. It's just a different way of doing it. So the question is, how different are these interactive platforms from the internet I knew growing up? The internet I had access to when I was growing up. I'm not that old, but I'm not going to reveal my age. It's just different. It was a different internet then. So I know you're hearing a lot about how the metaverse now it carries a lot of weight, and there are people saying that could be a hype. But I'm not even talking about this. I'm talking about interactive platforms that more generally, which are tangible. They exist already. And what are the new set of questions that we have to ask ourselves to account for these different platforms? So in more ways do the issues regarding children in these environments, these immersive environments, are different from those related to the web 2.0, let's say. And what are the key similarities and what are the main differences? So, and I think also, do current policies apply to immersive environments? So, Adam, I know we were talking about this before, and I was wondering if you'd like to start addressing that question.
Sure. I think a big thing that we all need to kind of appreciate is we still haven't caught up in regulating Web 2.0. There, you see regulations like the Digital Services Act, you see, the New Age Appropriate Design Codes, you see a bunch of online safety and comprehensive privacy legislations now just coming into force, and to deal with, really quite acute harms in the current web. Those harms will continue into the next version of the web. So I don't think the current suite of regulations that we see is by any means defunct. I think it will continue to apply and increase in relevance as we become more online and more and more of our social and economic lives really manifest online. So certainly, this is something that is current. We'll need to learn as these platforms evolve to see how new harms manifest and then address them. How new mediums kind of introduce new harms. I mean, talk about immersive reality, talk about virtual reality, the new points of data collection that you can get through immersive headsets increases someone's digital footprint enormously. So do we need new controls in kind of the hardware layer there as well as the software layer? But also just, talking about the term metaverse, and I know Laura from Roblox would certainly agree with me here. I think we need to maybe move away from this idea that the metaverse is all virtual reality or augmented reality. The metaverse is kind of, it is Roblox, it is Fortnite, it is these things right now. And I think that, the more we kind of understand that as an iterative phase of our lives online and our interaction online, I think, the more we can actually start addressing the harms we see.
Yeah, I'd love to pick up on that, actually. You raise a really good point. And I was thinking, when you mentioned, Paula, about, what's the difference between now and the internet that I experienced when I was growing up. And I come from a time before the internet, of course, so, or at least the World Wide Web, definitely. But, I think when all of us first started adopting this new technology, it was a place we went to, as opposed to the internet as we experience it now. And this is us as well as our kids and teens, is a place where they are. You don't go there. You're there from the minute you get up in the morning, when you check your work emails, you read the news on your phone, on your smart device, and then it just goes on and on and on. And so that element that Adam was mentioning of, platforms like ours that are really immersive. So I would definitely say we are a metaverse type platform, but it's because you can do so many different things in that platform. It is a whole world of both experiences, entertainment, shopping, hanging out with friends, all those things. It is a replica of the real world. And probably, all those years ago when it's like, okay, we're going to hang out down at the shopping centre and spend some time together. And then if you were lucky, you might go into MySpace or one of those kind of places, but it wasn't truly social in the way that these platforms are now, where they can literally still communicate in that space and co-create and those sorts of experiences. So I think, as I say, the immersive, the scale of it, the fact that it is It is everything. I know we've all been saying this for years. There's no such thing as online and offline for young people. That's been the same for a long, long time. So, you know, I know we're going to dig a bit more into kind of parents and education and all of those sorts of topics, but actually understanding that gap between what we experience in these spaces is not quite as big as the gap perhaps when, you know, the early adopters of social spaces back in the, as you know, in the late 90s and early thousands, those parents felt totally disengaged. They had no idea what this new stuff was about. But that gap between parent and child is a lot less now. So I think there's some real positives about how we can educate, but they just need to get a bit more familiar with the spaces.
Can I pick up on this one? And I think you've aged us all with the MySpace reference. You know, I don't think that we're quite in the space yet where, you know, we're in a future where children are wearing goggles to interpret their reality, but that is, you know, that is a very real future ahead of us. I think there's an even greater current danger in sort of the luxury that I can't even say it, anonymity can afford individuals who are intent on doing harm. And my main concern whenever I work in this space is really, you know, how do you know who your children are actually talking to? How do you regulate that? You know, we had spoken before this, and, you know, even my own child will say to me, you know, Mom, adults don't pretend to be children. And I'm like, what? Yes, they do. And I think what's interesting to me about this question and this conversation is really, if you've ever had the opportunity to sit in a room with parents and children and you ask them all the question, what is the metaverse and what is Web 2.0? I have never once received a consistent answer. Last week, we had teenagers that thought the metaverse had to do with deep space and that Web 2.0 was, you know, an e-commerce building platform. So I think for me, the big question is really, what are the gaps in education that exist between users and the interfaces that we're creating so that we can collectively establish a bridge in this very necessary conversation, right? To help people not only understand what they're using, but what potential risks are involved when you use them. And, you know, ultimately sort of safety in these environments is really about understanding our own level of accountability, right? And that it's a two-way street. And as parents, as caregivers, as educators, in these environments, integrated environments, you know, we have an obligation to understand the what as much as the how, to teach them what I love always to call, you know, digital hygiene. You know, there is a true responsibility on both ends. So.
And I'll pick up as well. I think Flynn just nailed it right there. It's about taking a step back and actually educating, you know, that these emerging technologies, these immersive experiences that we see today are here to enhance, you know, our offline world or the offline world of kids. And we got to go beyond the hype, because I think that that's where parents, industry, regulators are getting a little bit lost and kind of just converse and collaborate into seeing exactly what is it that we are actually experiencing, how it can benefit. Because I think, and we were just recently discussing it while we were waiting, right? Is it a disservice not to really educate children on how to properly participate in these experiences, because it is their social way of communication as of now, both online and then offline, because what are they going to talk about with their friends at school when they go there if they're not participating? And there have been actually studies that kind of move away from that whole understanding of, you know, screen time. That was what parents were actually concerned about before, and it's not actually about the screen time, but about the content. So if we educate what we're living, what we're doing, how they can actually interact, then I think we're gonna move past the hype and not just focus on the risks. The risks are real, they're undeniable, they're there, and they will be there in the future. But like Adam mentioned, we haven't even solved and actually operationalized and implemented and solve the problems that we're facing today. And everybody's very concerned of what is going to happen after. So let's take a step back and actually make ourselves present.
Sorry, Paula, you're on mute. I don't know whether you wanted to interject there. I just had a quick follow-up for Paula. I mean, you mentioned digital literacy and kind of educating people to engage online and educating kids to engage online. And I think there's a really interesting conversation about where responsibility for that lies. And it's not just with one party, I think it's with multiple parties. But I mean, platforms and can do their best. And Lego tries. We've got, you know, mini games. We have, you know, a lot of tools, interactive tools that are kind of explained in age-appropriate way to educate children about the risks of online engagement, how to be good digital citizens. But you know, that's not enough, and we can't guarantee parental engagement, and you can't be too patronizing towards children either. So is it something that needs to happen at a curriculum level in national education, or is it something that parents need to do as well? I think it's all three. It's a platform, government, and parental responsibility here. But it's very difficult to kind of, you know, ensure that those lessons are learned and ingrained and acted upon, right? Whilst also providing a really engaging space for children. It's a huge challenge.
I think for us, sorry. Yeah, you go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to oversell.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think one of the stakeholders that you didn't mention, which is a really tricky one, but has probably the biggest impact on parents, is the media. And so when we mentioned screen time earlier, for example, most of the rhetoric around that was, oh, addiction, and kids are, you know, seeing all this really harmful content all the time, and it's really terrible and bad. And of course, there are some cases where that happens, but that's not the norm for everybody. But parents see this all the time. And if there's no balance with the how to build resilience, how to have those conversations with your kids, you know, actually realizing that the low level stuff that happens is probably the stuff that's going to affect your kids. And it's okay to talk about those things. Here are some tools and tips and ways that you can have those conversations, but actually engaging, as you say, with all of those stakeholders. Educators are key, but I think in some places it kind of falls on them that they have a safety assembly once a year and that's it, tick, that's done. We always say, if something happens to you, to a kid or a teenager, go tell someone you trust. The first person they go to is their parents, and quite often it's them who feel most overwhelmed, underprepared, and pretty much terrified about what the issues are. So over to you, Flynn.
It's so interesting to me because I think that there's really a lot of villainy in this discussion globally, where there's a propensity to want to point the finger at one party, as Adam said, as, you know, as being responsible for this. It's, you know, it's the platforms, it's the policymakers. But I think we've sort of hit a point now where no one really has a corner to hide in anymore, right? This is an everyone problem. I think the idea of curriculum engagement is brilliant, and I think it is something that needs to be actively, you know, enforced. And what I always run into, especially when I'm talking, you know, to classrooms, is, you know, in the real world, we as adults have provided children with rules, boundaries, most of which have age applications, right? You have to be a certain age to drive, to vote, to get married, to drink. Yet we've given children, some as young as 2 and 3 years old, this unfettered access into a world where we simply forgot to codify them with rules. And at the rate at which safety incidents are accelerating, right? It's the same level of internet growth. We have to find a way to pull that back, and to, if we expect them to behave in a certain way in these environments, we have to provide them with the appropriate framework to do that. And that is parents, that is schools, that's policy. Like, these kinds of conversations, like the one that we're having right now, are so critical, because it's only going to be through that collaborative discussion, through that connectivity, that we find, we may not solve it yet, but at least we'd be on a path towards, you know, resolving some of the more imminent, you know, concerns.
Paula, just before I give you the floor, I think, well, this is certainly something I wanted to ask, is who bears the responsibility for ensuring that children are safe, right? And I think, like, as we were saying, it's a shared responsibility. But I think the question I would like to ask and throw back to you is, like, how can we empower children to make the informed decisions? We know about, you mentioned having those in the curricula, but what else? How else can we empower them to be aware of the risk that exists, and how can we have the tools and be savvy enough to understand what they're going into? Paula, I don't know if you'd like to answer that, or even provide?
I can get it started. Definitely. And I think it goes back. I agree with what Adam said. You know, it's every single one of the stakeholders, it's regulators, it's tech companies, it's parents, it's educators. And to answer your question, you empower them by talking to them early and often. It's about literacy. It's about getting them engaged. Like if you're providing the experiences the same way that you do offline, and we talked about it, it's the never ending struggle of a parent of finding the right balance. I want to give you all these opportunities, but these are my expectations, and this is how you responsibly use them. So if you're going to give a 2-year-old or 3-year-old your smartphone for them to get entertained and all that, it's not just about, you know, parental controls and putting that onus on the parents, because then we go into a controls paradigm and another series of conversations. But you have to tell them the expectations. You just don't give it to them. You tell them the same way, you know, this, whatever you do online, you know, it's going to have consequences offline. And I mean, we talked, or at least I do, like I said, I have a 3-year-old, and you talk to them, obviously age appropriately, but you tell them the realities of what they're doing, what you're expecting. I think the curriculum is brilliant, and I just second what Laura said. It's just about that balance, and it's ever changing. That's the only constant in emerging technologies, change. And so what works right now, well, you got to revisit it as technology. So you got to follow the technology, you got to follow the regulations, you got to follow. And I think media is one of the stakeholders that we're missing. I completely agree with you, Laura.
Thank you for that. Laura, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, when we're sort of, we work with lots of partners. I know Lego do as well. We have lots of the same partners, but we're part of the Digital Wellness Lab that comes out of Harvard and Boston Children's Hospital. And something that they talk about a lot, which is all, of course, based in kind of medical and research, it's really difficult because we all look at ages in buckets. So we're like, okay, this is appropriate because of CoPub, because, you know, it's a 13+ platform, or it's suitable for children and all ages. And then there's advice that's like, children up to this age should be allowed to access this content. But actually what they always bring us back to is that every single child is different, and that actually that's where the key bit is being flexible enough that you can have the conversations at the right stage for that child. Yes, okay, some of it we can broadly guess, but every 9-year-old is not the same. And I think sometimes we do them a disservice by, particularly when it does come to the more formal stuff like education, is like, right, when you're in this year at school, we're going to teach you this. But some kids will have had much more exposure to online spaces and devices and all of those things than others. And some of them will have parents who are like, no, you're not allowed to touch any of this until you're 11. And then they go home and it causes those conversations at home. So I would love to see a much more kind of, as I say, sort of earthy approach to this, and a sort of more holistic way that we can work with families at the different stages that they're at, as opposed to really just siloing it based on age.
I'm awful. I believe in fear mongering a little bit. Sorry. One of my favorite things to do is actually to speak at schools, but to the sort of preteen, you know, teen age. And it's mostly in way of trying to help them understand actual law and actual policy, and that just because there aren't concrete internet laws yet that regulate certain behaviors, that it doesn't mean that, you know, if something gets passed off to someone like me or, you know, or law enforcement, that there isn't a way to establish consequences for inappropriate and bad behavior. And one of the things that we always tell students is that, you know, when you're on a platform, and let's say this, I think it's different in the States than it is for you, but if you say something 3 times, you know, I hate you, you should hurt yourself, kill yourself, whatever it is, 3 times under statute here establishes a pattern of conduct. That's a felony. And when you start telling children, there's a difference between an accident, and accidentally on purpose, and on purpose. And when you're picking up your device, you're actively, you know, stating something, you're willfully hitting send, that's a whole lot of on purposes to not have consequences. And I don't, not to go too far off center, but I don't believe in an internet sheriff, right? We shouldn't be policing the internet. That's not, or platforms in general. That I don't think that that's the answer. But I do think we need to find a better way to establish realistic consequences for behavior that is dangerous and is unsafe. And to your point, not all children are the same. There is a true subjectivity to these experiences that, algorithms are just super duper bad at calculating, right? So how do we incorporate humanity back into to regulating the machines, So.
Paolo, I'll give you the floor, but after that, I would like us to move on to the next more policy-centered conversation, let's say. But please, and now you're on mute now.
Of course. No, just to the point that Laura said, you have to take into account not only the individuality and the context of the reality of the children offline, because do they have access? Are you taking into account the culture as well? Are you taking into account neurodiverse children? Because when you just focus on the arbitrary age groups, right? Are you taking into, I have a 7-year-old, she's neurodiverse, she's not at the same place that other neurotypical 7-year-olds might be to be able to access these platforms. And I think that that's where, you can see potential in organizations like XRSI's Child Safety Initiative. We can get diverse set of insights and perspectives from a global level to actually incorporate all of this, which is absolutely important.
Thank you, Paula. Actually, thank you, everyone. This is quite cool and exactly how we wanted to. So please keep just raising your hand and ideas to have this dynamic as possible. So in terms of like online safety and privacy and the existing policies and the shortcomings of those policies that exist, I wanted to ask you, what regulatory frameworks exist nowadays to ensure that interacts with those platforms and online learning experience or contents are child-friendly and safe? And what are the current shortcomings of those regulations? How can they be better? How can we improve them? So, Adam, yes.
I'm a massive digital policy wonk, so nerd. So that's the kind of question that gets me excited. So I think one thing that needs to happen is regulators who are responsible for privacy and online safety need to talk to each other more and understand where their respective remits end and where they align, and how they can communicate and build coherent policy frameworks that platforms can have certainty in design and build against. One classic example, I think, is this idea of content moderation, a really important feature of most interactive platforms. And you want to understand, what's happening in your platform so you can address problematic behavior. But equally, you need to do that in a proportionate way that doesn't unnecessarily invade the privacy of the people who you might be monitoring. So where does the line get drawn? Where does part of that will be kind of relying on cultural attitudes and might shift from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I've yet to kind of see a jurisdiction that really nails that question of, okay, here is where online safety begins and privacy ends. And often they're not in conflict, but sometimes they might be. Content scanning is a big debate right now in the online safety bill in the UK. And privacy advocates are, maybe justifiably, I'm not giving an opinion on that, but they're horrified at the prospect of basically algorithms running through everyone's content in order to identify for problematic behavior. Some of it really serious problematic behavior like child sexual exploitation, but maybe that gets caught up in some more innocent behavior. I think there's, and I'm going to say this as an anecdotal example because I'm not sure where I heard this from, but it always stuck in my mind. A father basically sending pictures of his child to his doctor to get something diagnosed was caught up as a child sex offender, for example. So there's really problematic things that happen when that policy line gets blurred. So that's just one example of an issue that I think it's really warranted that policymakers and regulators really pay attention to and understand the conflicts and the tensions and really try to chart a more certain path forward.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think we were discussing that too, right? Like the tension between security and privacy and how to address this. Is anyone else would like to? Yeah, Laura.
So I'm going to talk about the online safety bill. I know it's not in place yet, but we're expecting it any day now. We've been working on this for a really long time. In fact, we've been working on this for so long that I was in my old job several years before I moved to Roblox when we started these conversations. And so I've been involved from different aspects. I was involved from the charity sector, NGO support side and having those conversations, and then moved over obviously to the industry conversations that were being had with the government. It was really interesting having that move because the conversations that were being held were very different. So that's one thing that I think, causes problems when we have these conversations, to Adam's point of, if they don't really understand what the issues are and they're only hearing it from one point of view, they will sometimes ask for things that are just not physically possible by a platform, for example, because there was that disconnect about, in an ideal world, we'd like these solutions. Surely it can't be that hard to come up with them. But they are really hard, some of these things. And it does take, that whole working collaboratively to try to come up with the solutions. The other thing that was really interesting was, as momentum started building, that they were saying, oh, actually, yeah, we've forgotten to include this and we've forgotten to include that. And actually the video games industry was a complete afterthought, because when that was first started working on, it was all about big tech and social media, really specifically. So they just tacked on all of the other spaces, which now would be the metaverse spaces, all these immersive places we're talking about. That was a complete afterthought. So now the bill is like hundreds of pages long, and they're having to go back through it now to see if everything actually works. And so, I think whilst, yes, it is really important that there is going to be regulation, and, we were supporters of the California Children's Code. We think these are really positive things that start conversations and make platforms better. But to have something that's taken so long and still isn't in place is not helpful for kids and teens, because when they started, those kids and teens are adults now.
Well, in my country as well, sometimes we have the opposite problem. Sometimes we don't have enough conversation and rush regulations, well, which is not good. So I think the challenge is to finding the balance, right? Paula, you have your hands raised. Now you're in mute. Yeah.
There we go. Just picking up on that, I think that regulations and laws are just so complicated to pass, like what you're sharing, Laura, and they take so long that by the time that they actually come into place, they are outdated because the technology has gone away or has evolved so much. Excuse me. And that's where frameworks or guidelines, like the safety by design guidelines from the E-Safety Commissioner of Australia, is really important. And just going to touch for the people that don't know about it, just talks about the best interest of the child should be at the center of developing these types of platforms. Transparency and accountability. So all of these are principles and guidelines that platforms, emerging technologies, should take into account when they're developing, to try to just be a little bit more proactive instead of waiting for laws to kind of catch up. And I think that if we wait for them, like when Adam was saying, I think it's really important to have content moderation, but that also puts into conflict different human rights, like privacy versus freedom of expression. And then you have lawmakers just debating on this conflict instead of actually moving forward something that will guide and actually create the consequences that Flynn was mentioning before, right? We need actual tangible consequences of, if you do this and this and this online, this is going to be the consequences offline. Because as much as we have online and kids have online lives, they still live in the real world. So they have to be transferable. And that I think is missing. But I don't think that we're going to have to reinvent the wheel. There is privacy by design guideline. There is safety by design. And when you understand that security and privacy and safety can have a symbiotic relationship, then we can move forward with regulations that can actually apply.
I think I think you guys are very much ahead of the US side in a lot of ways with GDPR and everything else. But even here with, CCPA and COPA, I think we still run into an issue where when policy leads, technology has already moved way past where that policy is. And it almost sort of accidentally, you almost have to remind people that policy isn't optional, right? I mean, it is something that we need to follow. And just because the technology has moved past the point that was being addressed doesn't absolve you as a content creator, as a technology platform, it doesn't absolve you from future accountability. And I think when we can start incorporating those kinds of ideas into those frameworks, it sort of again pulls everyone back to say, how do we consistently keep the policy and the technology in touch with each other.
And I just want to really reinforce that point, Flynn. I think this whole move fast and break things mentality, I think the age of that has gone. It's consider the risks in the design process, look at safety by design frameworks, integrate that thinking at every stage of development, and then release a product that you're comfortable addresses these issues. I think, that shift needs to happen in industry. Lego certainly integrates kind of child safety and risk and child-centered design in all the products we build. We have a very rigorous process for doing that. And in that sense, we still have a big eye on what's compliant and what isn't compliant. But we're not driven solely by compliance. We're driven by a concern for our users. So I think that shift needs to happen, and I think is starting to happen, which is promising.
And just a quick question before I would like to give 10 minutes for the Q&A at least, but before we do that, I wanted to ask Laura, Adam, and everyone, what are the best practices for reporting and responding to online safety concerns, like from the developer side? Like what tools can we have to allow for that? Do we have in those platforms?
Well, we have a responsible child engagement team at Lego, which is a team consisting of child safety experts. They're integrated very closely with the development teams and the game design teams, and they contribute to this kind of gating process internally that considers risks at every single design feature. So they've got one eye on, what is in the best interest of the child, what is this kind of the global standard here, how does our discussions and work with UNICEF kind of flow into the game design, and then they're talking to development teams in their language about these risks. Because I think it's one thing that developers or industry often falls into, and I noticed this when I was a policymaker, is they have their legal teams kind of parrot some provisions of the Age Appropriate Design Code or some provisions of the Digital Services Act back at their technical folk in legal language, and they're not speaking the same language there, so you don't actually get the substantive policy objective, the aspirations actually met, because no one is understanding what's happening. And equally, the legal folk don't understand what some of these things look like from a technical perspective. So having these kind of intermediaries that can speak both language and then introduce these kind of considerations across the design process, I think is a really critical step.
Thank you, Adam.
So we have similar sort of processes. We have something called Trust by Design, which we use throughout any kind of product updates on the actual Roblox platform. And that is a truly cross-functional process, which means that all of those important teams like legal, policy, everyone's involved right at the beginning when the product is being conceived, as opposed to it being a tag on at the end where it's like, hey, we're going to launch this thing. What do you all think? And then everyone says, no, we're never doing that. So that's a really helpful internal process. And it just does those kind of, checks throughout to make sure that we're kind of on the right path. Roblox is a user-generated platform. So, of course, the one thing is making sure our platform itself is safe. But then, as you say, it's about how we work with our developers, the millions of developers all over the world, to make sure that they are, also building with safety in mind. So, of course, the first thing is that Roblox itself was a platform built for kids. It comes from a classroom app. many years ago, it was built for kids with kids in mind, and that has never changed. But we have grown up, we are aging up, and actually, you know, our fastest growing audience now is 17 to 24. So ensuring that the youngest people on our platform and those older ones still have that safe and positive and healthy experience when they come on the platform is challenging at times. But we, you know, to that point of we're really slow, we're really iterative, we kind of test things and test them and test them, and you know, we have very clear community standards, rules. You know, we work really closely with our developers. We have a developer relations team who really specifically hands-on work with those top devs with all the most popular games, and then we have lots of checks in place as well, that are not just reliant on the community to report issues and those sorts of things. We also have an intelligence team, which I can't share too much information about because that's the nature of the work they do, but they do spend a lot of their time kind of just in the platform, and monitoring for kind of any potential hotspots, things that we need to be aware of, and we try to be as proactive as possible in, you know, not just the moderation, but actually preempting potential issues before they bubble up.
I think the first rule of safety is never let an algorithm make a safety decision for you. And the second rule of safety is never let an algorithm make a safety decision for you. You know, at the risk of sort of plugging my own assets, we built all of our safety protocols. We engineered them in reverse. We actually spent 2 to 3 years addressing privacy and local regulation and laws before we even typed code. We don't use APIs. We don't use privacy infringing data. We use like a local only model. But I think what was interesting about the process that we sort of uncovered is that there's ways to build classifiers from a technical perspective that address an individual user's sort of online life and allows them to establish those boundaries. So when there is a standardized approach for the way that I report something to a platform or I report something to law enforcement, but it's based upon my unique set of subjective circumstances. You know, for example, if someone sends me a message saying that, you know, they think my son looks cute today, it doesn't violate any policy, but it certainly violates historically my sense of safety. And to be able to, again, to bring the humanity back into those spaces, I think is where these, you know, these tools are going. And again, it doesn't, no matter what tool you use, right? You don't need to use mine. But I think it's always critically important if you're using a suite of solutions, that you always remember that the tools that you're using are not there to make decisions for you. They're there to help you augment your decision-making process. And I think that goes back to what we've been talking about the entire time, which is education, education, education. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot to cover really, and a lot of questions that I have. I wish we had time to touch or topics to touch upon, but I wanted also to give some time for the audience, and they have come up with some questions. So maybe let's just jump into those. I'll start from question from Marcella. And then I don't know if there's, Marcella, if you wanted to direct it to someone in specific, but anyone is very happy to. I would be happy for anyone to respond. So, is there any regulation or international standardization for the video games industry and toys manufacturers in the accurate design and content that they are developing XR? So I don't know if Adam, you would like to.
Well, there's the Metaverse Standards Forum.
Yeah.
That is an international forum which is looking at standardization in immersive technologies. And there's also, you know, broader groupings like the IEEE and other standards bodies that also are considering this. So typically policymakers and industry representatives join together and discuss that work. And often they'll get adopted international regulation itself. So give those standards the force of law. So that is certainly happening.
And in terms of still international efforts, what are the mechanisms that exist to promote responsible and safe cybersecurity practices among minors? How can countries collaborate closely together?
Well,
yeah, sorry, I've got answers to that, but please, I won't hold the floor, Paula.
No, just quickly, I mean, that's part of the work that we're doing, right, at the Child Safety Initiative, bringing different stakeholders from different countries and just gathering the necessary knowledge so that we can build those safety frameworks that Adam referenced already are in existence. But like we said, it's emerging technologies, and we're taking the existing benchmarks like the E-Safety Commissioner of Australia's Safety by Design. We can take the ICOs from the UK's age-appropriate design guidelines and different standards that can evolve into a framework that then can be implemented into different countries and adopted by these. Go ahead, Adam.
I was going to say, I think you're also helped out to some extent by the regulatory superpower that is the EU. I mean, you've seen GDPR, for example, be adopted de facto by a lot of corporations that operate in Europe, but operate in other places around the world. So, and we're likely to see the same thing happen with the EU AI Act, maybe the Digital Services Act. When one kind of regulatory block that is big enough, has enough comprehensive legislation, that will often just have a force of gravity around it and look to kind of standardize things internationally. Privacy frameworks in the US, for example, at a state level, are now just adopting some kind of core concepts from the GDPR. So we already see that happen.
Thank you.
Do you have any interest in building an independent standards body? I think we could come up with something really interesting. I'm not
Let's do it.
We'll talk offline.
Okay, another question from Jake. So still on the global approach. Is there a need for a global approach to regulation, or is it best for each country to create their own regulation? Maybe Adam would like to answer that one too.
I mean, please, everyone jump in. I'm conscious of being too much of a nerd here. So I think a one-size-fits-all approach probably won't work because it won't be responsive to the particular policy needs and the cultural dimensions of each jurisdiction. So there is a process of negotiation, I think, and even if we have like a global example in that, or de facto example in the EU, that doesn't mean that that in every single jurisdiction we apply that, because sometimes that jurisdiction has decided they will either want higher or they want less stringent standards, and we adopt to that perspective. And that's because there's a democratic process there, or there's a recognition of kind of the peculiarities of that jurisdiction. So I don't think that approach necessarily works. But what needs to happen is discussion between different regulatory bodies, policymakers, to make sure even where there's points of misalignment, there's understanding and there's assistance for companies to kind of reach maybe not perfect harmonization, but at least kind of a good level of harmonization.
And you already have things like the Convention of the Rights of the Child from the UN that can set the stage, and that has a general comment that was passed in 2021 to see how we apply these children's rights into digital environments. So, and it's I believe the most ratified human rights treaty in the world. So you already have that global collaboration on what the basic standards are, or where you start from, right? But I agree with Adam that you can have these benchmarks and then you have to apply them to how it works culturally, socioeconomically, and to the actual jurisdiction and their own laws and democratic systems. So.
Thank you, Paula. Just going through there's a lot of questions, and just question from Obai. So we've discussed endpoints of safety, design, education, regulation. What about the access for children in the middle and approaches to age assurance? Anyone want to take this one?
So the age assurance thing is rumbling. I'm part of several working groups, I'm sure you guys probably are as well, where we're trying to tackle this problem. It's a really difficult one. It's not so hard for us, just in the sense that we're a platform for kids. So we can kind of just say, well, whilst we have age verification for the older people on the platform, so they can access additional, different products within the platform that wouldn't be suitable for some of the younger members. We're a platform built for the youngest audience. But a lot of the conversations that we have at a kind of policy level is still led by either the safety techs who are creating the technologies themselves, which are not one size fit all. We haven't seen solutions yet which would really be cross-platform suitable. And then there are locality issues. Even the fact that we can't kind of agree on the digital age of responsibility. It's 13 in some places and 16 in others and 18 in others. So there are just so many issues, particularly around that. It is something we're all going to have to collectively tackle. It's really important and is going to become one of the regulatory things. But I would like to see a bit more work from the governments who are going to be doing these regulatory things to help us to find these solutions that we're all looking for in that particular area.
Thank you, Lara. So another question from Samantha. So we're discussing policy developments or varying degrees of maturity and finality within the US, EU, and UK, etc., like we were saying before. So how do we ensure that children in the rest of the world are equally protected? Would the oversight sit in the jurisdictions of the company's headquarters as a start?
I would just say that you know, we don't look at we look at policy and regulation and you know, ensure we're compliant, but also, you know, it's the user, it's the child, it's the risk that's inherent there. That is our first consideration. So and that doesn't matter what market we're in, it doesn't really matter what the policies are. We want to ensure that, you know, the product is safe and appropriate for the children. So that protection is kind of ingrained in the culture at LEGO. And that would be my answer to.
Yeah, I concur exactly what Adam said. So whilst we're headquartered in California, there are certain things. So for example, we proactively report any child sexual abuse material. I mean, we don't host images, but conversations, grooming conversations or suspected grooming is all reported to NCMEC, National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, which is the standard for any US hosted platforms. But that said, we don't just follow US regulatory as a best practice. We use, you know, clearly we have a wonderful policy team who are always kind of keeping a finger on the pulse around what's happening all over the world. And then that helps to inform, not necessarily to set, but to inform some of our policy decisions internally, along with the expertise that we have in-house. We have child psychologists on board, we have researchers on board, data scientists, etc., who are helping us to really build out community standards and policies that make the platform safe for everybody in every jurisdiction. Then the multi-layered thing that you were talking about, Flynn, you know, not only with the safety tools that we use, but actually having the ability to turn things on or off in certain jurisdictions as required, but we don't set it to the lowest denominator. We will just put those additional things on when required to in certain countries.
Thank you. So I know we're on the hour, but I just want to ask a last question. And so are fines such as the Fortnite fine enough to protect children, or more severe trade restrictions on company itself would be better or a more effective option? So I guess this one would be nice to hear from all of you, or whoever wants to start first. No?
I mean, I would, you know, I live in a sort of nice rose-tinted glasses world. I would like to think that we don't have to have too many of those cases happening. Most of my experience, you know, we work with many other tech companies in lots of collaborative projects. And the overwhelming experience that I have is that platforms want all of their people, all of their community to have a good time on the platform. We're not there to be exploitative. We're not there in any way to abuse, whether it be data or, you know, or otherwise. There are obviously some companies who've either deliberately or not deliberately made mistakes. But I hope that what's already happened is enough to get people to just kind of review where they're at. I'd like to think that we're proactively trying to avoid those things as opposed to reactively dealing with them when there's threats coming in.
Thank you, Lara. If anyone wants to
I think my job is a little bit different, where I'm, you know, especially in my private practice, I'm the person that you call when the horrible things have already happened. So my perspective is a little bit skewed to the, you know, far left of dark and paranoid. But I think, again, provided that we're still encouraging appropriate use of these immersive technologies in the ways that they were intended, that I think all of the legal parameters and regulatory parameters start to finally find their way. Not today, but soon. I hope. I think that's where we're headed.
And I think that the parts of consumers, even though that we've been talking and completely agree, you know, it's all about education. They are more aware today than they were a few years ago, like with how we started the conversation. And I think that I want to believe that companies are starting to see that it's not all about compliance, and they have to shift into the best interests if they really want to maintain the current users and actually understand that there's more to it, and there's more ROIs, and there's more benefits to being diligent, proactive, safe, child-centered, human-centered. And I want to believe that that's where we are trying to lead, and that's what we're trying to bring forefront, so that, because deterrent and just compliance fear, I believe we're moving past that.
I just want to say 100%, Paula. I couldn't agree more. I think it's yeah. I think companies are realizing that it's not just the right thing to do. There's actually a market for it. And while you shouldn't be driven by commercial incentives there necessarily, it's a happy coincidence and it's a virtuous circle.
Thank you, guys. So there are other questions. We haven't had time to address all of them. And Luca also dropped a link for anyone who has questions, and we can take them offline and ask our speakers to address them and send the response on your way. So unfortunately, there was only 1 hour and a lot to talk, but I found super engaging, and I'm very grateful for your time. Really, it was very interesting, and I hope we have a session number 2, because there is still a lot to talk about, and we hadn't had time to touch upon everything. But it was a start, like we say, and we're getting there, and it's great to see people like you working on it, on the topic, and I'm sure. I feel I mean, a bit happier about my children in the future. Hopefully everything will be fine. So thank you, guys, and have a wonderful morning. Paula, Flynn, have a wonderful afternoon, Laura and Adam, and we keep in touch. And everyone that has joined us, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
this was
much.
great.
Thanks, everyone.
Take
Bye.
care.